The dust settled like a shroud over Bitter Creek as Marshal Jake Thornfield rode into town, his weathered hands gripping the reins of a horse that had seen too many miles and too much blood. The year was 1887, and the frontier still held its breath between the old ways and the new, between the law of the gun and the law of the land. What Jake carried in his saddlebags wasn't just warrants and legal documents, it was the weight of an ancient code that would force him to choose between two sisters, between duty and desire, between the man he was and the man he needed to become. The Whitmore Ranch sat like a fortress against the crimson horizon, its sprawling acres testament to the empire built by old Samuel Whitmore before consumption took him the previous winter. Now his daughters, Catherine and Elizabeth, held the deed jointly, bound by their father's final will in a way that would test every man who dared approach their threshold. The old patriarch had written his legacy in iron and blood, decreeing that whoever would claim one sister must claim them both, not in marriage, but in protection, in responsibility, in the sacred bond of kinship that the frontier demanded. Jake had known both women since they were children running barefoot through the sage, their laughter echoing across valleys that now bore the scars of cattle drives and claim disputes. Catherine, the elder by 2 years, possessed the fierce intelligence of a woman who had read every book that came through Denver and could outshoot most men in the territory. Her dark hair caught fire in sunlight, and her green eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from watching too many good men die too young. Elizabeth, younger and gentler in appearance, carried a steel core that revealed itself only in crisis. Where Catherine's strength was obvious as thunder, Elizabeth's was subtle as lightning. You didn't see it coming until it struck. The marshal's boots rang against the wooden planks of the ranch house porch as he approached the door, knowing that what waited inside would challenge every principle he had built his life upon. The leather document case at his side contained more than legal papers. It held the deed to a choice that would define not just his future, but the future of everyone in Bitter Creek County. Catherine opened the door before he could knock, her keen eyes taking in the dust on his clothes, the exhaustion in his face, the careful way he held himself like a man expecting trouble. "Marshal Thornfield," she said, her voice carrying the same musical quality he remembered from childhood, though now tempered with the authority of a woman who had learned to command respect in a world that rarely offered it freely. "Elizabeth said you'd sent word you were coming." Behind her, Elizabeth emerged from the shadowed hallway, her blonde hair caught back in a practical bun, her blue dress bearing the slight stains of morning chores. Where Catherine stood with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, Elizabeth moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to observe before acting, to think before speaking. Both women bore the unmistakable mark of frontier life, the slight calluses on their hands, the straight-backed posture that came from years of physical work, the clear-eyed gaze of those who had faced hardship and emerged stronger. "Ladies," Jake said, removing his hat and allowing himself a moment to truly see them both. In that instant, the weight of his mission pressed down upon him like the summer heat. He had come to Bitter Creek to enforce a law that predated territorial government, a code written in the harsh realities of frontier survival. The Whitmore sisters owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, controlled the best water rights, and commanded the loyalty of dozens of cowhands. But they also stood at the center of a brewing range war that threatened to tear the territory apart. The documents in his case outlined the ancient statute that governed inheritance disputes in unsettled territories, a law designed for a time when survival trumped sentiment and practical necessity overruled personal preference. According to territorial precedent dating back to Spanish colonial times, when a ranching inheritance was left jointly to unmarried sisters, any man who sought to claim guardianship or marriage rights must accept responsibility for both women's welfare and safety. The law existed to prevent the division of vital resources during dangerous times, ensuring that frontier families remained strong and united against external threats. What made Jake's situation particularly complex was that he had been appointed by the territorial governor to resolve the escalating conflict between the Whitmore Ranch and the Garrison Syndicate, a group of Eastern investors who had been systematically buying up smaller homesteads and pressuring established ranchers to sell. The Garrisons had made increasingly aggressive moves against the Whitmore holdings, from rustling cattle to filing spurious legal claims, and recent intelligence suggested they were planning something more direct and violent. Jake's orders were clear: establish territorial authority over the range war by whatever means necessary, protect the Whitmore holdings as a matter of territorial security, and ensure that the largest ranch in the region remained under local control rather than falling to outside interests. What his orders didn't specify was how a bachelor marshal was supposed to accomplish this while navigating the complex web of frontier law, family loyalty, and his own complicated feelings for both sisters. The evening sun cast long shadows across the ranch house interior as Jake spread the legal documents across the dining table, the lamplight flickering over pages that would reshape their lives. Catherine studied the papers with the intensity she brought to everything, her finger tracing the archaic language while Elizabeth read over her shoulder. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of understanding what these documents meant. So the territorial law requires that any man claiming guardianship over our ranch must accept legal responsibility for both of us, Catherine said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was reading. Not marriage, necessarily, but a bond that's legally equivalent in terms of protection and obligation. Jake nodded, his own throat tight with the complexity of what he was asking. It's an old law, designed for times when frontier families needed to stay united to survive. The territorial government wants to invoke it now because your ranch represents strategic territory in the Range War. If the Garrison Syndicate gains control of your water rights and grazing land, they'll effectively control the entire southeastern section of the territory. Elizabeth looked up from the documents, her blue eyes reflecting the lamplight. And, you're the man the territorial government wants to serve as our guardian? The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Guardian implied protection, but it also implied authority. It meant that Jake would have legal standing to make decisions about the ranch, about their safety, about their futures. It also meant that his life would become permanently intertwined with theirs in ways that went far beyond simple friendship or professional duty. The governor believes that having a territorial marshal serve as your guardian would provide the legal framework needed to resist the Garrison Syndicate's pressure while maintaining local control of the ranch, Jake explained, though even as he spoke the words, he could hear how inadequate they sounded. How do you explain to two intelligent, independent women that the law requires them to surrender their autonomy to ensure their survival? Catherine stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she could look out over the land her father had died defending. The Whitmore Ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, encompassing some of the finest grazing land and the most reliable water sources in the territory. It represented not just wealth and security, but independence and legacy. To lose it would mean losing everything their family had worked to build. The Garrisons made another offer last week, she said without turning around. Triple what they offered 6 months ago. They're getting desperate, which means they're getting dangerous. Elizabeth joined her sister at the window, the two women standing side by side as they had so many times before when facing uncertain futures. 3 of our neighbors have sold to them in the past month, she added quietly. The Henderson place, the Murphy homestead, and the old Peterson spread. They're buying up everything around us, creating a corridor that would effectively cut us off from the main cattle routes to Denver. Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with understanding the full scope of a problem. The Garrison Syndicate wasn't just trying to acquire land, they were implementing a systematic strategy to isolate and pressure the Whitmore Ranch until selling became the only viable option. It was a tactic he had seen before in other territories, always employed by men with enough capital to play a long game and enough ruthlessness to destroy lives in pursuit of profit. There's more, he said, pulling additional documents from his case. Intelligence suggests the Garrisons have hired a private security force. Men with experience in range conflicts in Wyoming and Montana. They're not planning to wait much longer for you to accept their offer voluntarily. The implications settled over the room like storm clouds. Private security forces in frontier conflicts rarely limited themselves to defensive measures. They were hired to intimidate, to create incidents that would justify retaliation, to make life so dangerous and difficult that resistance became impossible. Catherine turned from the window, her green eyes blazing with the kind of controlled fury that Jake remembered from their childhood when she had faced down bullies twice her size. So our choice is to surrender our independence to the Garrison Syndicate or surrender it to the territorial government through an ancient guardianship law. That's one way to look at it, Jake admitted, appreciating her directness even as it complicated his mission. Another way would be to see it as choosing your own protection rather than having protection forced upon you. Elizabeth returned to the table, her fingers tracing the legal language as if she could find some hidden loophole that would preserve their autonomy while ensuring their safety. What does guardianship actually mean in practical terms? What authority would you have over our decisions, our property, our lives? It was the question Jake had been dreading, because the honest answer revealed just how much he was asking them to sacrifice. Under territorial law, a guardian had significant authority over his ward's major decisions, from business transactions to personal relationships. It was a legal structure designed for a time when women were considered incapable of protecting themselves or managing complex affairs, though Jake knew that both Whitmore sisters were more capable than most men he had encountered. Legally, I would have authority over major financial decisions regarding the ranch, the right to approve or reject suitors, and the obligation to ensure your physical safety and moral welfare, he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. In practical terms, it would depend on how we chose to interpret those obligations. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake could hear the clock on the mantel marking time, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft whisper of wine through the sage. He could also hear the unspoken questions hanging in the air. How would they navigate the complex emotional territory of such an arrangement? How would he maintain professional objectivity while living in intimate proximity to both women? How would they preserve their dignity and independence within a legal framework designed to deny both? Catherine broke the silence with characteristic directness. And if we refuse? If we choose to face the Garrison Syndicate on our own? Jake met her gaze steadily, knowing she deserved an honest answer. Then, you'll be facing them without territorial support or protection. The law will see you as having rejected government assistance, which means you'll have no legal recourse when things escalate beyond cattle rustling and property disputes. When, Elizabeth noted quietly. Not if. Jake nodded grimly. The intelligence reports suggest they're planning something within the next 2 weeks. Something designed to force a resolution one way or another. The weight of that revelation settled over them all. 2 weeks to make a decision that would reshape their lives forever. 2 weeks before the relative safety of legal maneuvering gave way to the harsh reality of frontier violence. Catherine returned to the table, her hands spread flat against the polished wood surface as she studied the documents once more. You said this law requires the guardian to accept responsibility for both sisters. What does that mean for you personally, Marshall? What are you risking by agreeing to this arrangement? It was a perceptive question, one that cut to the heart of Jake's own internal struggle. Accepting guardianship of the Whitmore sisters would end his career as a territorial marshal, tying him permanently to one location and one set of obligations. It would also mean navigating the complex emotional landscape of protecting two women he cared about deeply, though in different ways and for different reasons. More than that, it would mean confronting the weakness he had spent years trying to hide, his inability to choose between duty and desire, between the safe path and the right path, between the man others expected him to be and the man he actually was. For years, Jake had moved through the territory like a ghost, never staying long enough in one place to form lasting attachments, never allowing himself to want anything badly enough that losing it would destroy him. But, here, in this lamplit room with these two extraordinary women, he could feel that careful emotional distance crumbling. The realization terrified him more than any gunfight or frontier conflict he had ever faced. It means giving up my commission and accepting that my future is tied permanently to this ranch and this family, he said finally. It means taking responsibility for decisions that will affect not just my life, but yours as well. It means. He paused, searching for words that would convey the magnitude of what he was contemplating. It means becoming the kind of man who stays instead of the kind who leaves. Elizabeth looked up sharply, her blue eyes searching his face as if she could read the history of every departure, every time he had chosen duty over connection, obligation over attachment. Is that what you want? To become the kind of man who stays? The question hung between them like a challenge, demanding honesty he wasn't sure he was prepared to give. Jake had spent so many years defining himself by his mobility, his independence, his ability to solve other people's problems without becoming emotionally invested in the solutions, that he wasn't sure he knew how to be any other kind of man. But, looking at Catherine's fierce intelligence and Elizabeth's quiet strength, thinking about the ranch that represented their legacy and the dangers that threatened to destroy it, he realized that perhaps it was time to discover whether he was capable of becoming someone different. Someone better. Someone worthy of the trust they would be placing in him. The next morning brought news that compressed their timeline dramatically. Jake's deputy, Tom Bridges, rode hard from town with word that 3 more ranchers had received final offers from the Garrison Syndicate, each accompanied by clear threats about what would happen if the offers were rejected. More troubling still, several of the Whitmore ranch hands had been approached by Garrison representatives offering double wages to quit their current employment and sign on with the syndicate's operations. Catherine received the news while standing in the ranch house kitchen, her hands flour-dusted from making biscuits for the breakfast her sister was preparing. The domestic scene felt surreal given the gravity of the situation, but Jake was beginning to understand that this was how frontier families faced crisis, by maintaining the rhythms of daily life even as the world shifted around them. "How many of our hands have they approached?" Catherine asked, her voice steady despite the implications of the question. "Near as I can tell, about half," Tom replied, accepting the coffee Elizabeth offered him. "Most of them came straight to me or to you, but there's always a few who might be tempted by easy money." Jake studied the young deputy's face, noting the worry lines that had appeared since his last visit to the ranch. Tom Bridges was barely 25, but he had the steady demeanor of someone who had grown up fast in a hard country. More importantly, he had the loyalty of someone who understood what the Whitmore family represented to the entire region. "There's something else," Tom continued reluctantly. "Word is the Garrisons have made contact with some of the Comanche bands that have been raiding through the northern sections. Nothing confirmed, but the timing feels suspicious." The implications of that possibility chilled everyone present. If the Garrison Syndicate was desperate enough to encourage Indian raids as a way of pressuring local ranchers, it indicated a level of ruthlessness that went far beyond normal business competition. It also meant that the timeline for making decisions had compressed from weeks to days. Elizabeth set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, her composed exterior masking what Jake was beginning to recognize as her method of processing crisis. Where Catherine's emotions showed clearly in her expressions and posture, Elizabeth's ran deeper and quieter, requiring careful observation to detect. "We need to make our decision today," she said quietly. "Waiting any longer puts everyone at risk: our hands, our neighbors, the entire region." Catherine nodded, her green eyes reflecting the kind of determined resolution that had made the Whitmore family legendary throughout the territory. "Marshal Thornfield, we need to understand exactly what you're proposing. Not the legal framework, but the practical reality of how this arrangement would work." Jake had spent most of the previous night considering that very question, knowing that the success or failure of any guardianship arrangement would depend not on legal technicalities but on the human dynamics between the three of them. The law provided structure, but it couldn't navigate the complex emotional territory they would be entering. "I propose we interpret the guardianship law as narrowly as possible while still providing the legal protection you need," he began carefully. "Major financial decisions would require consultation between all 3 of us, with my authority used only to provide legal standing in disputes with outside parties. Personal decisions would remain yours to make, with my input offered only when requested or when I believe your safety is directly threatened." Catherine leaned forward, her lawyer's mind dissecting his proposal for potential problems. "And living arrangements?" "The law specifies that the guardian must reside on the property to fulfill his protective obligations." It was the question that had kept Jake awake most of the night. The ranch house was large enough to provide separate quarters, but the intimacy of sharing daily life with both sisters would test every boundary he tried to establish. More than that, it would require a level of emotional honesty and communication that none of them had ever attempted. "I would request the small cabin near the main house," he said. "Close enough to respond quickly to any threats, far enough away to maintain appropriate boundaries. But I won't lie to you, this arrangement will require all of us to navigate territory we've never explored before." Elizabeth stood abruptly, moving to the window where she could look out over the land that had shaped her entire life. "There's something we haven't discussed," she said without turning around. "Something that makes this situation even more complicated than the legal and practical considerations." Catherine's eyes met Jake's across the kitchen table, and he saw in her expression that she understood what her sister was about to address. The emotional complexity that had been simmering beneath the surface of their discussions was about to become explicit. "All 3 of us know there are feelings involved here that go beyond friendship or professional obligation," Elizabeth continued, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of vulnerability that made Jake's chest tighten. Pretending otherwise would be dishonest and dangerous. The truth hung in the air between them like lightning waiting to strike. Jake had known both sisters for most of their lives, had watched them grow from spirited children into remarkable women, had carried feelings for both that he had never allowed himself to examine too closely. Catherine's fierce intelligence and passionate nature had always drawn him like a flame, while Elizabeth's quiet wisdom and steady strength had offered the promise of peace he had never found elsewhere. Catherine's laugh was rueful but not bitter. Leave it to Elizabeth to address the elephant in the room with characteristic directness. She looked at Jake with eyes that held no judgment, only honest acknowledgement of their complicated situation. We all know that under normal circumstances, a bachelor marshal doesn't volunteer to bind his life permanently to two spinster sisters out of pure civic duty. Jake felt his face flush, but he met her gaze steadily. And, under normal circumstances, two intelligent, capable women don't agree to surrender their legal independence to a man they've known since childhood unless they trust him completely. Trust, Elizabeth repeated, still facing the window. That's what this really comes down to, isn't it? Not just legal arrangements or practical necessities, but whether we trust each other enough to navigate whatever feelings exist between us without destroying the thing we're trying to protect. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones, less tense, more contemplative. They had finally acknowledged the emotional complexity of their situation, which somehow made it feel more manageable rather than less. Tom Bridges cleared his throat diplomatically. I should probably head back to town, check on the situation there. But, Marshal, I need to know, are we looking at a possible arrangement here, or should I start preparing for a different kind of conflict? Jake looked at both sisters, seeing in their faces the same combination of determination and apprehension he felt in his own chest. Give us until sunset, he said. We'll have an answer by then. After Tom's departure, the three of them spent the day working through the practical details of what their arrangement would look like. They walked the ranch boundaries together, discussing security measures and identifying potential vulnerabilities. They reviewed the ranch's financial records, with Catherine explaining the complex network of contracts and obligations that kept the operation running. They talked to the ranch hands, gauging their loyalty and their willingness to stay despite the increasing pressure from the garrison syndicate. But, underneath all the practical discussions ran the deeper current of what they were really negotiating: how to preserve their individual identities while accepting the profound interdependence the guardianship law would create. How to honor the feelings that existed between them without allowing those feelings to compromise their primary obligation to protect the ranch and everyone who depended on it. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the range, Jake found himself alone with Elizabeth in the ranch house parlor while Catherine met with the foreman about security arrangements. Elizabeth was mending a saddle strap with the kind of focused attention she brought to everything, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency despite the complexity of their conversation. You're afraid, she said without looking up from her work. It wasn't a question. Jake considered denying it, then realized that dishonesty would serve none of them well in their current situation. Terrified, he admitted. I've spent my entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility. Staying mobile, staying unattached, convincing myself that independence was strength rather than cowardice. Elizabeth's hands stilled on the leather strap. And, now I'm beginning to think that maybe the strongest thing a man can do is admit his weaknesses and ask for help overcoming them. She looked up at him then, her blue eyes holding the kind of understanding that made his chest ache. Catherine thinks you're in love with her. The statement hit him like a physical blow, not because it was untrue, but because it was incomplete. And, what do you think? I think you're in love with both of us, Elizabeth said quietly. In different ways, for different reasons, but deeply enough that choosing between us would destroy part of who you are. Jake felt something inside him crack open, a wall he had built around his heart crumbling under the weight of her gentle honesty. And, how does that make you feel? Elizabeth's smile was soft but tinged with sadness. Like maybe I understand why the old law was written the way it was. Maybe our ancestors knew that sometimes the heart doesn't follow convenient boundaries, and sometimes the strongest families are the ones that learn to love in ways that don't fit traditional patterns. Before Jake could respond, Catherine appeared in the parlor doorway, her face flushed from her conversation with the foreman and, her hair escaping its pins in the way that always made Jake's pulse quicken. She looked between them, reading the emotional tension in the room with her characteristic perceptiveness. "The hands will stay," she announced. "Every one of them. Martinez says they'd rather fight the Garrison Syndicate than abandon the ranch. But, they want to know what we've decided about the guardianship arrangement." Jake stood, feeling the weight of the moment settling over him like a mantle. "Before we make this official, I need you both to understand something. If we do this, there's no going back. Not just legally, but emotionally. We'll be committing to building something together that none of us have ever tried before, something that will require honesty and communication and trust beyond anything we've ever demanded of ourselves." Catherine moved to stand beside her sister, the two women presenting a united front as they had so many times throughout their lives. "We understand," Catherine said. "The question is whether you understand what you'd be committing to." Two strong-willed women who have managed a successful ranch operation without male supervision, who have their own opinions about everything from cattle breeding to territorial politics, who aren't going to suddenly become docile just because the law gives you authority over our decisions. Jake's smile was the first genuine one he had managed in days. "I'd be disappointed if you did. The last thing this territory needs is for the Whitmore sisters to lose the fire that made them legendary." Elizabeth stood as well, her decision visible in the straightening of her shoulders and the lift of her chin. "Then, we're agreed. You'll file the guardianship papers with the territorial court, and we'll face whatever comes next together." The formal signing took place that evening in the ranch house dining room, with Tom Bridges serving as witness and the ranch foreman representing the interests of the hands who would be affected by the arrangement. Jake's signature felt heavy on the documents, each letter committing him further to a future he couldn't fully envision but was determined to help create. As the witnesses departed and the legal formalities concluded, the three of them found themselves alone with the magnitude of what they had just accomplished. The guardianship arrangement would be registered with the territorial court within the week, providing legal protection against the Garrison Syndicate's pressure while binding their lives together in ways that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Catherine poured whiskey for all three of them, the amber liquid catching the lamplight as she raised her glass in a toast. "To partnerships that don't follow conventional rules," she said, her green eyes holding both determination and uncertainty. "To finding strength in unexpected places," Elizabeth added, her own glass raised. Jake looked at both women, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment and the unknown territory that stretched ahead. "To becoming the people we need to be," he said finally, "instead of staying the people we've always been." The glasses touched with a crystalline chime that seemed to echo through the house and out across the range, sealing a commitment that would be tested by everything the frontier could throw at them. None of them knew exactly what they had just created, but they all understood that it was something worth defending. The first test of their new arrangement came sooner than expected. Just 3 days after the guardianship papers were filed, a party of armed men wearing Garrison Syndicate badges rode onto Whitmore Range and began systematically cutting fence lines and driving cattle toward the territorial boundaries. It was a deliberate provocation, designed to force a response that could be used to justify escalation. Jake received word of the incursion while working with Elizabeth to repair storm damage to one of the outlying line shacks. The message came via one of the younger ranch hands, his horse lathered from hard riding and his face grim with the knowledge that the long-anticipated conflict had finally begun. "Martinez wants to know if we should ride out and confront them," the young man said, his hand resting unconsciously on the butt of his sidearm. "The boys are ready to defend the ranch, but they're waiting for word from you." Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with command decisions, but this time it was complicated by the knowledge that his choices would affect not just his own fate but the futures of everyone connected to the ranch. The old Jake would have assessed the tactical situation and made a quick decision based on immediate objectives. But the man he was trying to become had to consider longer-term consequences and the welfare of people who depended on his judgment. Tell Martinez to gather the hands but not to engage unless directly threatened, Jake decided. "We're going to handle this according to territorial law rather than range custom." Elizabeth looked up from the lumber she had been sorting, her blue eyes reflecting understanding of what his decision meant. Handling the situation through legal channels rather than direct confrontation would take longer and require more patience, but it would also establish precedents that could protect other ranchers facing similar pressure. "You're thinking like a guardian rather than a marshal," she observed, and Jake could hear approval in her voice. "I'm thinking like a man who has to live with the consequences of his decisions for the rest of his life," he replied, surprising himself with the honesty of the admission. They rode back to the main ranch house together, arriving to find Catherine in the ranch office surrounded by legal documents and territorial statutes. She had been preparing for this moment since the guardianship arrangement was finalized, researching every precedent and regulation that might provide leverage against the Garrison Syndicate's tactics. "The fence cutting violates 3 separate territorial statutes," she announced without looking up from her research. "The cattle rustling adds federal charges if we can prove the animals were driven across territorial boundaries. But we need documentation and witnesses if we're going to make any of it stick in court." Jake admired the methodical way she approached the problem, her legal mind cutting through emotional reactions to focus on actionable solutions. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking they needed if they were going to defeat opponents who had both financial resources and political connections. "What kind of documentation?" he asked, moving to study the territorial map spread across her desk. "Photographs if possible, detailed written accounts from multiple witnesses, evidence of property damage with estimated repair costs," Catherine replied. "Enough documentation to make it clear that this was an organized effort to destroy our operation rather than random criminal activity." Elizabeth joined them at the desk, her practical mind immediately grasping the challenges involved. "The garrisons will claim their men were responding to alleged boundary disputes or protecting their own cattle. We need evidence that proves intent to damage our operation specifically." It was exactly the kind of complex problem that required the combined strengths of all 3 partners in their unusual arrangement. Catherine's legal expertise, Elizabeth's practical wisdom, Jake's law enforcement experience, and the loyalty of ranch hands who had known the Whitmore family for years, together they represented resources that no individual could match. Over the following week, they implemented a systematic response to the Garrison Syndicate's pressure campaign. Ranch hands worked in pairs to document every incident of trespassing and property damage, using one of the new portable cameras Jake had acquired from Denver. Catherine prepared detailed legal briefs challenging every spurious claim the syndicate filed with territorial authorities. Elizabeth coordinated with neighboring ranchers to establish mutual defense agreements and share intelligence about Garrison activities. But, even as they built their legal and practical defenses, Jake could feel the emotional complexity of their arrangement growing more intense. Living in close proximity to both sisters, sharing meals and conversations and the daily intimacy of frontier life, forced him to confront feelings he had spent years avoiding. Catherine's passionate nature drew him into debates about everything from territorial politics to cattle breeding techniques, her intelligence challenging him to think more deeply about problems he might have approached superficially before. Elizabeth's quiet wisdom provided a steady anchor during crisis moments, her ability to see long-term patterns helping him make decisions that served their ultimate objectives rather than immediate emotional needs. The problem was that his feelings for both women continued to deepen, creating an emotional complexity that threatened to undermine the professional objectivity their situation required. He found himself noticing the way lamplight caught the red highlights in Catherine's dark hair, the graceful efficiency of Elizabeth's movements as she worked in the ranch house kitchen, the different qualities of intelligence and strength each sister brought to their shared endeavors. More troubling still, he could see that both women were experiencing similar emotional conflicts. Catherine's touches lingered when she handed him documents, her eyes holding his gaze longer than necessary during their evening planning sessions. Elizabeth's smiles carried a warmth that went beyond friendship, her conversations revealing an intimacy that assumed shared futures and permanent connection. The situation came to a head during a late evening discussion of security arrangements, as autumn weather brought the first hint of winter's approach. They were gathered around the ranch house fireplace, the warm light creating an atmosphere of domestic intimacy that made their emotional restraint feel increasingly artificial. "We need to talk about what's happening between us," Catherine said finally, her directness cutting through the careful politeness they had all been maintaining. "This arrangement is working from a practical standpoint, but it's creating emotional complications that we can't continue to ignore." Jake set down the territorial statute he had been reading, acknowledging that the conversation he had been dreading was also the conversation they needed to have. "What do you want to discuss?" I want to discuss the fact that you're falling in love with both of us, and that we're both falling in love with you," Elizabeth said quietly. "And I want to discuss what that means for the future of this arrangement." The truth hung in the firelit room like smoke, visible and unavoidable. Jake had known this moment would come, but knowing hadn't made it easier to face. "How do you acknowledge feelings that seem to violate every social convention while honoring the legal and emotional commitments that make those feelings possible?" "You're right," he admitted. "And I don't know what to do about it." Catherine's laugh held no humor. "The ancient law that brought us together was designed for a time when survival trumped sentiment, when practical necessity mattered more than personal preference. But maybe our ancestors understood something about human nature that we've forgotten." Elizabeth leaned forward in her chair, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight as she studied Jake's face. "Maybe they understood that sometimes the heart doesn't follow convenient boundaries, and that the strongest partnerships are the ones that acknowledge emotional complexity rather than trying to force it into traditional patterns." Jake felt something shift inside him, a recognition that the weakness he had always tried to hide, his inability to choose simple paths when complex ones offered greater truth, might actually be a strength in their current situation. "Are you suggesting that we stop trying to navigate around our feelings and start figuring out how to navigate through them?" "I'm suggesting that we're already committed to building something that doesn't follow conventional rules," Catherine replied. "Maybe it's time to admit that our emotional lives don't have to follow conventional rules either." The conversation continued late into the night, as they explored possibilities that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. They talked about marriage customs among frontier families facing extraordinary circumstances, about the difference between legal arrangements and emotional commitments, about the ways love could be expressed and honored even when it didn't fit traditional patterns. By the time the fire burned down to embers, they had reached an understanding that felt both revolutionary and ancient, as if they were rediscovering something their ancestors had known but subsequent generations had forgotten. They would continue to honor the legal framework that protected the ranch and their individual autonomy, but they would also explore emotional arrangements that acknowledged the complex web of feelings binding them together. It wasn't marriage in any traditional sense, but it was commitment to each other, to the ranch, to building a life together that honored both practical necessity and emotional truth. They would face the challenges of their unusual arrangement together, drawing strength from the very complexity that made their situation unique. The final confrontation with the Garrison Syndicate came with the first serious snowfall of winter, when reduced visibility and harsh weather provided cover for more aggressive tactics. Jake received word that armed men had occupied one of the line shacks on the northern boundary of the ranch, apparently planning to establish a permanent presence on Whitmore land. This time, the response required more than legal documentation. Jake gathered a party of the most experienced ranch hands, including Martinez and several men who had served in territorial conflicts before settling into ranch work. They rode out in the gray dawnlight, knowing that the coming confrontation would determine whether the Garrison Syndicate would accept their legal defeat or escalate to more violent methods. The occupied line shack sat on a rise overlooking one of the best grazing areas on the ranch, its strategic position making clear that the Garrison forces intended to control access to essential resources. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that the occupying party had settled in for an extended stay rather than a quick intimidation raid. Jake studied the situation through field glasses, noting the number of horses in the makeshift corral and the way the men had positioned themselves to command approaches to the building. These weren't cowboys hired for temporary work, they moved with the discipline of men experienced in frontier warfare. 6 men, well armed, good defensive position, he reported to Martinez. But they're occupying buildings on our land without legal authority. That gives us options they don't have. What followed was a careful application of territorial law enforcement procedures, conducted with the patience and documentation Catherine's legal research had shown would be necessary. Jake announced his authority as a territorial representative and guardian of the Whitmore Ranch, demanded the immediate withdrawal of the trespassing party, and provided formal notice that continued occupation would result in federal charges. The response was predictable. The Garrison forces claimed they were protecting legitimate business interests and accused the Whitmore Ranch of interfering with lawful activities. But their aggressive posture and refusal to produce documentation supporting their claims provided exactly the evidence Jake needed to justify more direct action. The confrontation itself was brief but decisive. When the occupying party refused to withdraw despite repeated warnings, Jake's group moved to surround the line shack and cut off escape routes. The garrison men found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by opponents who knew every rock and gully on the contested ground. The surrender came without bloodshed, though the tension remained high throughout the process of disarming the trespassers and documenting their equipment and activities. Jake's careful adherence to legal procedures meant that the incident would result in federal charges against the garrison syndicate rather than a simple range dispute that could be dismissed by territorial courts. More importantly, the syndicate's defeat marked a turning point in their campaign against local ranchers. Word of their failed occupation spread quickly through the region, encouraging other property owners to resist pressure and cooperation with territorial authorities. The precedent established by the Whitmore Ranch's successful defense would protect other families facing similar threats. The ride back to the ranch house took place in companionable silence, each man processing the significance of what they had accomplished. Jake found himself thinking not about the tactical success of the operation, but about the way the ranch hands had looked to him for leadership and trusted his judgment in the crisis. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly responsible for other people's welfare, not just their immediate safety, but their long-term security and prosperity. Catherine and Elizabeth were waiting on the ranch house porch when the party returned, their relief visible despite their attempts to maintain composure. Jake could see in their faces that they had spent the day confronting the possibility of loss, understanding that the confrontation could have resulted in his death or injury and fundamentally altered their carefully constructed arrangement. "It's over," he announced simply. "The federal marshal will be filing charges against the syndicate leadership, and their private security force is heading back to wherever they came from." Elizabeth's smile was radiant with relief and, something deeper, pride in what they had accomplished together and recognition that their unusual partnership had proven itself under the most challenging circumstances. Catherine's expression held similar emotions, but also a fierce satisfaction that their legal strategy had worked exactly as planned. That evening's celebration was subdued but deeply meaningful, as the ranch hands gathered in the main house to share whiskey and stories about the day's events. Jake found himself studying the faces of men who had chosen to stay and fight rather than accept the garrison syndicate's offers, understanding that their loyalty represented something more valuable than money could buy. Later, after the hands had returned to their quarters and the three partners found themselves alone again, the conversation turned to the future they would build together. The immediate threat had passed, but the experience had clarified their understanding of what their arrangement could become. "You've changed," Catherine observed, studying Jake's face in the lamplight. "Not just in the past few months, but in the past few weeks. You move differently, speak differently, think differently." Jake considered her words, recognizing the truth in them. "I feel different. More settled, but also more alive. Like I've finally stopped running from the person I'm supposed to be." "The person we need you to be," Elizabeth added softly. "But also the person you wanted to be all along, even when you didn't know it." As winter deepened over the ranch, their unusual household found its rhythm. Jake's quarters in the small cabin provided privacy when solitude was needed, but most evenings found all three partners gathered in the main house, sharing meals and conversations that ranged from practical ranch business to philosophical discussions about frontier life and social conventions. The emotional complexity of their arrangement continued to evolve, but the crisis had taught them all that their feelings for each other were a source of strength rather than weakness. Catherine's passionate nature and Elizabeth's steady wisdom complemented each other in ways that made their shared partnership more effective than any traditional marriage could have been. Jake discovered that loving both sisters in different ways didn't diminish either relationship but actually enriched both. Catherine challenged him intellectually and emotionally, pushing him to think more deeply about everything from territorial politics to personal ethics. Elizabeth provided the steady anchor he had never found elsewhere, her quiet strength offering a sense of home he had never expected to experience. More importantly, he began to understand that the ancient law governing their arrangement had been designed by people who understood that survival in harsh environments required flexibility and adaptation. The rigid social conventions that worked in settled communities often proved inadequate on the frontier, where practical necessity and emotional truth mattered more than traditional propriety. The ranch prospered under their combined management, with Catherine's business acumen, Elizabeth's practical skills, and Jake's law enforcement connections creating opportunities that none of them could have achieved individually. Their success attracted attention throughout the territory, not just for its financial implications but for its demonstration that unconventional arrangements could work when based on mutual respect and shared objectives. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities as the territorial government began considering applications for statehood and the legal frameworks that would govern the transition. Jake found himself appointed to committees studying frontier law and its adaptation to more settled conditions, his experience with the guardianship arrangement providing insights that proved valuable to lawmakers struggling with similar issues. But perhaps the most significant change was the way their household had become a model for other frontier families facing complex circumstances. Other ranchers dealing with inheritance disputes, women managing properties without male relatives, and communities trying to resist outside pressure began looking to the Whitmore Ranch for examples of how to navigate between old laws and new realities. Jake realized that his greatest accomplishment wasn't the successful defense of the ranch or the defeat of the Garrison Syndicate, but the demonstration that a man could acknowledge his weaknesses and limitations while still fulfilling his responsibilities to the people who depended on him. The strength he had found in accepting help rather than insisting on independence had transformed not just his own life but the lives of everyone connected to their unusual partnership. As he stood on the ranch house porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Jake understood that he had finally learned the lesson the frontier had been trying to teach him for years. True strength didn't come from avoiding complex situations or maintaining emotional distance, but from embracing the full complexity of human connection and finding ways to honor both practical necessity and emotional truth. Catherine joined him on the porch, her hand settling naturally on his arm as they watched the day fade into night. "Any regrets?" she asked, her voice carrying the comfortable intimacy of someone who knew his answer but wanted to hear it spoken aloud. "None," Jake replied, and meant it completely. "This isn't the life I planned, but it's the life I needed." Elizabeth emerged from the house to stand beside them, her presence completing the sense of rightness that had settled over their household. "The territorial court approved another guardianship arrangement this week," she announced. "The Morrison sisters, using our case as precedent." Jake nodded, understanding that their success had created possibilities for other families facing similar challenges. The ancient law that had seemed so restrictive and archaic had proven flexible enough to accommodate changing circumstances and complex emotional realities. "Maybe that's what the old legislators understood that we've forgotten," he said finally. That the law should serve human needs rather than forcing human needs to serve the law. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the three partners stood together in comfortable silence, each understanding that they had created something worth defending and worth emulating. Their arrangement would continue to evolve as circumstances changed and their understanding of each other deepened, but the foundation they had built was solid enough to support whatever challenges the future might bring. The man who had once defined strength as the ability to stand alone had discovered that true strength lay in the courage to stand together, acknowledging weakness and limitation while building something larger and more meaningful than any individual achievement. The frontier had finally taught him its most important lesson, that survival and prosperity came not from avoiding complexity, but from embracing it fully and finding ways to turn challenge into opportunity. In the growing darkness, with the woman he loved in different but equally profound ways standing beside him, Jake Thornfield understood that he had finally become the man he was meant to be, not perfect or without weakness, but strong enough to face whatever came next with the knowledge that he would never have to face it alone.